Good morning, Halifax. I'm honoured and delighted to be here. I think I can't live up to that stuff because that's not real. I'm going to talk about other stuff. I think we're in a really important moment, and I think, and probably you saw the news today in Brazil. We've elected a very interesting president, which follows on a trend that we're starting to see around the world. And I think when we start to talk about the city, I think we have to make a paradigm shift in the scale of the challenges that we have to talk about. And I want to talk about democratizing the city. And in terms of that conversation, I don't mean the vote. Too often we talk about democracy as the idea of the vote. I want to talk about democracy as the agency to create the city, right? So if you look back at the history of democracy making, it isn't the vote. The vote is the end pinnacle. What actually happens is you get democratization of banks for the poor, you get schools for the poor, you get universities, you get educational institutions, you get all of this stuff happens before the vote happens. And if we want to talk about the challenge of democracy, and I think we do have a challenge of democracy, is we have to really deeply understand the opportunities and threats that our democracies place and the critical role of our cities. Cities are at the forefront of 21st century challenges. They are the knot where actually all these forces are coming together. And one of the challenges I want to put down for the art of city building is, are we really responding to the scales of challenge we face? And if we sort of pull on with that, oops, maybe we pull on with that. Maybe. Yeah, and keep going. Let's talk about this graph. These graphs are really important. If we look at the kind of growing issue of inequality around the world, what you start to see is we're seeing actually wealth concentrate in the hands of the few. We're starting to see actually the benefits of globalization. What you see on the right-hand side, or my left-hand side, what you'll see is what's called the Branko-Milanovic elephant curve. This elephant curve dictates where the benefits of globalization took place. And what you realize is the developed world middle classes, which are here, actually saw very little benefit from globalization. Wages have largely stagnated in many parts of the world for the middle classes, and what we're seeing is actually an issue of whether we call it Trump or Brexit or any of these realities. These are products of things that are going on in our world. And it's really important we bring them into the conversation of city making. And you can carry that forward with this. I found this stat deeply, deeply important. 4% of the world's wild mammals, 4% of the world's mammals are wild. 4%. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 56 billion cattle in the world. 4% of the world. So, and it's about 30% of all the birds in the world are wild. 70% are poultry. So when we talk about the city, we need to see the city as a system which is massively infecting the world that we have around us, right? And I'm now only beginning this story. Maybe. You perhaps have seen this. Watch these graphs. Watch these. What you start to see is anomalies in climate change and cities around the world. Every city, major city in the global north has gone 2 degrees on top. Everywhere in the world, pretty much. That's 2017, and 2018 was worse. So we keep going. We often, this is for the UK, but I suspect it's not that different from other parts of the world. Where's the benefits of wealth? Where are they being accrued? Well, they're all largely being accrued in land. For all our talk about, tech startups and all this other stuff, land is where the net wealth is being accrued. And it's not because land has become more valuable. The reason why it's being accrued is because our economy has gone from a tangible assets economy to an intangible assets economy. And in an intangible assets economy, those assets are interwoven. And places and cities become more valuable in those realities. And land is where those values are captured. So if I was to, for a moment, ask many of you, who owns our houses? Who owns a house? Put your hands up. How many of your houses have gone up in value over the last 20 years? Right? So here's a little trick question, right? Has your house physically gone up in value? Most probably not, right? You've probably done some decorations and moved through the house. The house physically is a depreciating asset. The land itself, probably not even agricultural grade land, so the land wasn't that valuable. Where did the value of that house come from? It's access to roads, transportation, parks, schools, all the social infrastructure that actually gives its value. So when your land has gone up in value, your house has gone up in value, what's likely gone up in value is public goods have gone up in value. Your house, here's the key word, gives you monopolistic access to those public goods. Now, why is that important? Because historically we saw private housing as the idea of my private wealth. But the reality is my house hasn't gone up in value. Public goods have gone up in value. I've captured those values. Now, this is important because if we start to see the city from this aggregative sense, so I'm not criticizing this. I think there's an opportunity to reframe value. There's an opportunity to start to rethink how we deal with the challenges of the 21st century. I'm going to stand closer here. And in this context, I think we also need to think about the scale of automation. So if you look at any of the theories that are out there on actually scales of automation, we're about to see one of the biggest transformations in our labor forces that we've seen. Go back to the 1800s to the 1840s, you had a 40-year, it's a period called the Engels Pause, where we saw the massive transformation in workforces, wages declined, and productivity went up. And I think we are starting to see the effects of this story already. I want to put down a hypothesis that Brexit and Trump weren't just phantoms of kind of just people's, they're also understandings of actually humans, the perception that humans are going to be a liability in the future economy, in a capital economy, a perception. So I would say the reason why we are all talking about increasing borders is because we think, well, actually humans are going to be a cost. Humans are a liability. So the reason why I say this is that I think we have to start to engage these conversations, not that I believe it, but I think we have to start to embrace the scale of transition that's coming, which is equivalent, in real terms, equivalent to an industrial revolution. And in the age of industrial revolution, we built new institutions, new infrastructures, new ways of seeing the world. It is no longer sufficient to tinker at the edges. And if we go forward, we spend most of our time hunting unicorns. So you see often the conversation is, who's got $1 billion startup? But let me put you back. The IPCC report gave us about 12 years to deal with climate change. On our watch. That is in our watch. So when we talk about the art of city building, we are talking about cities which are going to have to deal with climate change, deal with automation, deal with biodiversity losses of a scale and order that we've never seen before, and deal with a fundamental inequality of a network economics and platform economics which are concentrating wealth in the hands of the few. That is the future of the city that we need to be embracing and talking about. So that's kind of the opening, let's talk about this seriously. At the same time, what we have is politicians, UK politicians, you guys are better, I hope. UK politicians like Michael Gove who turned around and said, we're going to address climate change. Yeah, fine. And then what happens? And they say, well, we're going to ban plastic straws. Okay. Plastic straws count for 0.01% of plastic waste. And the reason is, and there's a reason that we cannot deal with the complexity of these conversations. And we pick obvious answers to deal with these problems. But that's not a problem of the politicians, that's a problem of us, of how we look for simple solutions, simple answers in a complex world. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face is, how do we deal with change? How do we deal with complexity? This diagram in front of you is all the drivers of obesity, just obesity. And what you see is there's multiple issues. Obesogenic environments, to foods and drinks, to policy infrastructure, whole sorts of interventions. And they're never going to be led by one party or one person or one organization. So if anyone turns around and says, hey, would you mind writing the obesity strategy? You know that's not real. Because there's 50, 60 different organizations and actors involved in that reality. How do you build a movement for change? There is our problem. And I've just spoken about obesity. Right? If you look at any of our big social challenges, they require us to innovate the way we drive change. It is no longer possible for a single managerial order mechanism because there's too many actors. And all of those actors need to innovate together. Yet it's always far more convenient to turn around and say, you know what, we're going to put a sugar tax on it. It's much easier because it's a simple solution, you know, magic bullet. But you don't have to deal with the structures of change that are required. And I think this is one of the kind of structural discussions we have. And you can talk about this, or you can talk about children, right? So if you want to look at children's outcomes, air pollution has significant impact on children's IQ. Air pollution, air particulates. Nutrition, globally, we're seeing food nutrition decline substantively around the world. And people are looking at cognitive stumping being of the order of 20 IQ points in the next 50 years. This is just food nutrition cycles. So when we start to talk about this stuff in the larger scale, and I've not even talked about, you know, prenatal nutrition, postnatal nutrition, breakfast clubs, all of this stuff that's required to drive this change, I've not even addressed that. So you want to shift the education of cities? It's not enough to just talk about schools. So how do we drive change in some of this stuff is, I think, a fundamental problem. And I suppose my role here is to be the provocateur and challenge the discourse of city building and challenge the reality that you have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with extraordinary actors around the room to actually take a substantive leap forward. And the next 10 years is not going to be like the last 10 years. That I guarantee you. I'm going to come over. This is just a really good example to manifest that conversation I was having about food. That is our land use of America. What do you see, the big yellow thing? Where do you see urban housing? My point is these things are connected. You know, if you want to do something about climate change, I will probably talk about this later, simplest thing is go vegan. I'm telling you, this is where we're all headed. It's not even going to be much of a choice by the time this plays out. So when we start to look at some of this stuff, you start to look at the challenge of how do you drive innovation across 40, 50 different agencies at the same time? How do you drive change across multiple organizations? This is a map of public services in Hertfordshire. So looking at 40, 50 different public services that are given to elderly people in Hertfordshire. How do you drive change into these multiple actors is actually increasingly one of our problems. And you start to realize that the solutioneering is not about a single product. Too often we end up designing buildings, but actually the problem is as much procurement or as much about actually how we even understand. This was done about homelessness. In the UK, homelessness policy has nothing to do with homelessness. It's everything to do with how you allocate public housing. Right? That's what it's actually all to do with. And in order to be classified homeless, you have to be lying down on the floor. You cannot be sitting up. You have to be lying down on the floor when people go around with a counter. Right? So the policy infrastructure fundamentally changes and influences the realities we make. And I can talk about a lot of this stuff in detail later in one-to-ones. And also, food systems. We were asked to look at food systems in Dubai, and we did a whole mapping. What was the first question that came out? Everyone wanted quaint little sustainable food recycling at the end of restaurants. That's what they were looking for. You know, when you get to recycle the food at the restaurant, we were like, when you map the system, that's not the issue. The issue is substantial. Right? The issue is how Dubai actually goes vegan, if you look at the food story. So my first thing is, are we looking at the right scale of problems with the right scale of challenges that are on the table? And they're going to come on our watch. And they're going to come both with opportunity, but also with challenge. And the solutions for me are often diagonal. And as designers and placemakers, we often focus on objects, but I would argue that actually the issue is as much about how we design and create new models of regulation, which I'll talk about, as it is new business models and other methods of dealing with this stuff. And this is some of the work that we've been doing around urban systems drivers, and I can tell you the science behind this stuff is far more erudite. The science about linking air pollution to actually children's outcomes is significant. But actually, we haven't been able to build a political infrastructure and the political will behind it because we're not able to have the conversations. I don't blame the politicians. It's how do we have the civic conversation of recognizing the issues. I still have drivers telling me, I have a right to drive. And I say, do you have kids? Yes. Do you have the right to actually literally murder kids? Because about 800 children die a year as a result of asthma and pneumonia-related illnesses, certainly in places like the UK. And how do we short-circuit these cognitive realities? And we have to start to become recognizing we are both the solution and part of the problem. And it is a collective issue. It's a civic issue. It cannot be done by imagining ourselves as individuals. The next part of this conversation, I've got two parts, and this is part two, or 3 parts, and this is part 2, is how do we imagine what it means to be human? And I think the reason why I say this is much of our discourse of being human is actually rather old-fashioned. And cities have always had a relationship of what it means to be human and the imagination of what it means to be human and the nature of the cities that were built. But actually, when you look at the science of being human, our conception of meritocracy, words like this that we've often become familiar with, I am here because of my success. No. You're not here because of your success. You're here because you had successful conditions, environments around you that supported you to be successful. Actually, my personal contribution to my success is minute. And it takes humility to say that and recognize that we are a product of our conditions. But also, it takes humility to recognize that this is a Dutch famine. We know in epigenetics terms, actually, the impacts of poverty pass 2 generations down the line. And if the impacts of poverty pass 2 generations down the line, what does justice mean? What is justice? What is equality? I think these are questions that we need to deeply ask ourselves. And we know that, in a way, if you put people in financial stress, they make different types of decisions. Right? We know financial insecurity deprives actually IQ points, and it happens to any one of us. If I put any one of us in significant stress, our ability to make complex decisions is eroded. And I would argue that our economic model, which has increased precariousness around the world, economic precariousness of people's lives, has actually destroyed our ability to think long and deep about the problems that we have. Right? That there's a reason why we're making a certain type of societal decisions. Oh, I wish this would work. And even the illusion of actually me as a human, the reality is less than 50% of you is biologically human. The rest is actually a huge bunch of other organisms that work with us. We are a multitude of organisms symbiotically working together. And even better than this, my thought patterns are not my own. They have actually cognitively, we replicate thought patterns of our friends and our associates. You know when your mum used to say, don't play with those friends, you will start thinking like them. Well, she was right. Right? So when we start to live in these realities, what does this mean? What is the idea of equality and justice in that world? And if you go back into some of the stuff about long-term emotional scars, in a high cognitive, high emotional economy, what does that mean in terms of unlocking the future of our collective realities? And then perhaps something like this. This is Dr. David R. Williams, and I think it's the most extraordinary piece of work, which looks at a Harvard professor who's been looking at the impacts of actually, he's been looking at the impacts of racial violence and racial aggression in America. And what he looked at was that people that were equally educated, right, were dying 10 years in advance of their peers, equally educated. Now, what he found was it was to do with microviolence. And the microviolence is everyday microbehaviors. And we've all experienced them, right? Those little things which actually somebody's constantly needling you, constantly trying, and what they did was they drive high levels of cortisone in your bloodstream. Persistent levels of cortisone, which actually drive your high level of propensity for obesity, heart disease, and other chronic issues. So people are literally dying as a result of this stuff. So if I was to take you up on Captain TJ's enterprise, 100 years into the future, I guarantee you we will look back at this and think, shit, we knew the pathways, we knew what was happening, and we knew people were dying. And we know in poverty people die up to 20 years in advance of people that are well off. People are dying. And we now know the pathways of that stuff. So there's one thing saying there's a correlation. There's another thing saying, oh my God, we know how this stuff links. So the reason why I big this up is actually it's important for us to recognize the science of this stuff is well in advance of our ability to create policy and our ability to create new political justices. And the justice is not a gift. It's also about how we unlock and unleash everyone. So every one of you here is more extraordinary than any general artificial intelligence that's ever been made or is likely to be made for the next 40 years. Every human being is more powerful. Here's the deep question. Have we unlocked the full potential of every Halifax resident? If I told you you are more powerful than any general artificial intelligence ever been made, if IBM walked over and said, I'm going to give you Big Blue 95, you'd go, wow, great. And I'd walk over and give you a human, and I go, it's more extraordinary. I don't think we have. I don't think we've even thought about the capacity to do that. Now go back in history. We built schools in Industrial Revolution because we recognized we could unlock the capacity of humans. How do we unlock the next generation of thinking around that? How do we deeply unlock the full capacity of being human in a way that we've never done before? We may think this is a kind of crazy-ass conversation, but how about this? In places like Vietnam and Taiwan and other places, this is the conversation going down. People are starting to think deeply about how we create the capacity for high cognitive, high emotionally intelligent societies, because that will be the new machine-human relationship. So this is not just a kind of quaint, nice reality. It's actually the new reality of a new hybrid. We already have a machine-human relationship. What will that look like in the 21st century? I think it's going to be really key. In these things, we are multitudes. We are strangers. Being alone is equivalent, and being loneliness is equivalent to having 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes. Our relationship epigenetically, in terms of our history and our context, is real. It's manifest. This is why I say we are entangled with each other. The idea of me as an individual is a lovely idea, but the reality is I'm entangled, both in space and in time, with all of you. And that, I think, is one of the profound transformations that we're starting to see, is how do we transcend the idea of the individual, which is just a conception. It was just a drawing, an idea of seeing the world. The idea of seeing the world through objects was actually a reality that we conceived in the 15th to 16th century. It is not total. There's a brilliant ethnographic piece of work that was done where they took paintings and showed them to a child born in a Western background and one child shown in the Eastern background. The child shown in the West would say, I see a vase. You ask them again, they describe the context. You show the same painting to a child born in the East, they would describe context. And then they would describe vase. So our social realities are constructed like the color blue. The color blue is a social reality. We gave it words and we recognize its reality. We have to construct and reconstruct our social realities. These aren't fixed terms. And I would say, more profoundly, for me, that we are they. We cannot define ourselves as individuals. We have to recognize ourselves in that reality. Just some stats that you might find useful. That's the scale of the transformation that we're talking about, 290 billion. How do we, in that future, reframe humans not as an overhead, but actually as a place of creativity and wealth? In order to do that, we're going to have to reimagine our institutions very foundationally. And also reimagine our bureaucracy. Reimagine it from, this is the conceptual model at the heart of most of our bureaucratic model, which is about the individual, profit, and the purpose, which is fine. I understand where this comes from. But the reality is, you can extend that thinking. I don't know how many of you know $1 Million Blocks, which is a brilliant project in Chicago. This is about actually looking at the social costs. So to go to, in the US, to go to prison costs $144,000 a year. $144,000 a year. To go to, I think it's Yale, is about $75,000. So when we start to think about some of this stuff, the reason why we don't think of it through that lens is because we don't look at future social costs. The state doesn't account for future liabilities and future costs. So it's an accounting challenge. So social impact bonds, which some of you will know about, are actually about bringing future social costs to allow them to be invested against. So how do we start to think about that in terms of our cities and genuinely allow us to build preventative intervention? We all know preventive intervention is possible and necessary, but the challenge is we don't have the state accounting infrastructures to deal with it or provide it. I'm sure this is the same pretty much most places. That's the relationship to healthcare, bad healthcare to housing, bad housing to healthcare. It's massive. Yet we think of housing as an individual unit, but the social costs are there. In that world, how do we start to think about smart policy? How do we start to think about smart rights? How do we start to think about some of the stuff that we're starting to imagine? And these things are coming. So whether it's looking at models of governance, which I hope Bianca will talk about as well, and other people, we are also seeing the reimagination of bureaucracy. So one of the big things I want to let down here is Uber. What did Uber destroy? Uber destroyed not the cab driver or the cabbie, destroyed the cab office, right? That's what it disintermediated. What it's reframed is actually our administration. We're about to see the biggest transformation of our cities to become post-managerial cities. As we saw post-industrial cities, we're about to see post-managerial cities. So the glass tower blocks that we've been used to building administrative quarters for, they're probably at the end of their cycle of value in the next 10 years, because those jobs are the ones that are being actually disintermediated. The question is, how do we reimagine governance and bureaucracy in that world? Right? This is a deep question, and most people are not investing in governance. And we're about to see a transformation of governance, whether it's smart contracts or whether it's actually any of the stuff around smart governance. So, New Zealand have done some really good work on looking at machine-readable law and machine-readable policy. What will that do to our new reality? How do the inbuilt biases that are being built into our institutional infrastructure, how do we start to deal with them? So it's important that when we look at cities, we also look at actually the transformation of governance that we're about to see. I could go on, but I won't. I think I'm well over my time. But also look at crazy stuff like reimagining property rights. Property rights as they currently are being unbundled. How we organize them, use rights, development rights, future resource rights. These can be separated and split apart in ways that we've not seen. Current property rights are being bundled together. This stuff, technology is enabling us to happen. And also allow for differential taxation on all this stuff. Real-time differential taxation on actually title deeds, property rights infrastructure. So there is a lot of shifting of bureaucracy that will transform how we see our cities, whether it's accounting or infrastructure, all the way through to building new ways of looking at property infrastructure linked to value. Because, as I was saying, your house's value is linked to actually infrastructure. Also opening up new ways to finance common goods. So this is a High Line project that we're doing in the UK, where we're looking at, so the New York High Line built massively private housing, the wealth about a quarter of a block in, massively went up in value. So public goods, common goods, created massive amounts of private wealth. How do you link the two together? So what we're doing is looking at smart covenants, linking private property, uplift of land value, back into funding the common infrastructure. So these sort of new business models are actually about business models for common good, which historically were too difficult to deliver because the cost of administration was too high. So I would put forward, actually there's a whole new class of public value business models that are going to be opened up in the 21st century as the cost of administration of system financing is going to be significantly lower. I think private value was the value of the 19th and 20th century. I think common value will be the value of the 21st century. And there'll be whole new value creation in that. How do we do that? There's lots of interesting things coming out around that. Preventative health. We all know preventive health is critical, but it requires massive transformation in our accounting rules, in how we govern, how we invest into places, many, many things. So if we want to drive this transformation of delivering real city transformation, we're going to have to build some of the institutional infrastructure for that. How do we go from contract formations, which are object-orientated, so changing an architect's contract to not be focused on the building and the capital spend, to actually be focused on the outcome? Imagine, so I'm going to end pretty much here in the next 2 minutes, so TJ is probably not getting too nervous. So imagine as an architect you were asked to design a prison. Now, one model of designing a prison is to say, I'm going to design a number of cubicle spaces and it's all going to be safe and secure. Another way of looking at a prison is, how do I reduce reoffending rates? And the objective of the investment in prison is to reduce reoffending rates and offending rates. How would you design that solution? Radically differently. Because you wouldn't design it to incarcerate people, you design it for a different outcome. And increasingly we have the capability to look at that stuff differently. There's a brilliant ashram prison, which actually you go in, and including the wardens, they do a 30-day silence as you enter the prison. And the reoffending rates are less than 3%. It's actually a learning and rehabilitation environment. So we know the accounting of this stuff increasingly. We know the contracting of this stuff increasingly. I think this is the time where we have to give ourselves permission to build the institutions fit for the 21st century, which are there to unlock and unleash the value of every human around you, who is more extraordinary than any machine that has been given to us. And I think that is our failed obligation. The real deficit of every city is the deficit of actually not unlocking that full capacity. And that is a strategic opportunity that is on our table. So, in this story, I want to end here. If we want to talk about the future of cities, I think we have to talk about many of these things. We have to talk about how we drive inclusive growth, how we create the infrastructure for inclusive growth. We have to talk about how we build the human development institutions for the 21st century, reimagining our schools, our universities, our nurseries, our environments to actually unlock the full potential of every human. We have to build cities that are actually designed for preventative intervention in terms of health. That's just not about individually, but also as neighborhoods at every scale, as well as building all the regulatory infrastructures and the boring stuff. Because actually underpinning the reason why we don't do preventive health is because we don't have an accounting rules for it. So the great transition that we're in the middle of, and automation, I want you to keep that on top of your list. This is not about economic development doing whatever they're doing, and the city builders kind of doing nice sort of pop-up meanwhile uses. This is about a great transition of our cities. And it will be an integrated transition. And it will require a vision to step forward and drive a different discourse. And it won't be done by a politician leading by themselves. We have to be all part of the story and recognize this is a transition of all the environments we see around us. So with that, I'll thank you, but here's some important questions that I want to put up. And I think these are important philosophical questions that we need to have on our table. I won't talk through them, but I think in a world of interdependency, what is freedom? What is sovereignty? What is democracy in a post-privacy world? You could argue that we don't actually have privacy in the first place now. What does any of that work looks like? What is agency and freedom in a predictive economy? These are the big philosophical frames that are on our table. What is work beyond humans as labor? And the transformation requires us to move all the way up this chain, from democracy of actually expression, imagination, democracy of care, democracy to innovate, all the way through the chain. This won't be done in a small way. This is my favorite film from Interstellar. And I think this quote is really useful, because I think the biggest risk we face is we imagine the future is a zero-sum game. And it's all about dividing the dirt that we have now. How much will you have? How much will I have? Whereas the future is infinite. And actually we have to reimagine and democratize and re-believe in the stars again. Because only then, I think, can we solve these problems. Let's look back up into the sky and dream of our place in the stars. Let's not fight for our place in the dirt. And I think that is about giving hope and democracy of imagination to actually our reality and what is a beautiful place called Halifax. With that, I thank you.